Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Jawad Tehami. As of today, globally, the COVID-19 death toll has reached nearly 75,000 with over 1.3 million infected cases. The pandemic has affected 191 countries around the world, with a surge in the cases in the Middle East and North Africa as well. There are over 1,300 cases with 67 deaths in countries including Syria, Libya, Iraq and Palestine, while no data is available about Yemen. This is a region which is already badly affected by conflicts and people there face dire conditions. Now, a new sword is hanging on their head in form of COVID-19. How is this pandemic affecting the conflicts in these countries, and what is actually required at this crucial time to be done to lessen people's miseries? Already, the UN had urged for a universal ceasefire in order to combat the pandemic effectively. To discuss this, we are joined today in Newswire by Mr. Nicolai Gundersen, Middle East expert, joining us from London, and Mr. Fadel Abdul Ghany, analyst and chairman and founder of the Syrian Network for Human Rights from Doha. Gentlemen, thank you for your time at Newswire. I'll start with you, Mr. Gundersen. The COVID-19 outbreak turned into a pandemic when Turkey and Russia agreed on a truce. But there were little hopes that the truce will last long. But on the other hand, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says that in March there has been the lowest death toll since the conflict started. Is it because of the danger of the pandemic spread that the warring factions have reduced their activity in the country?
Well, I think that's certainly a factor. We have to recall that this pandemic is spreading widely and quickly. And when you have a refugee crisis, when you have internally displaced persons who don't have access to sanitation, there is a huge risk that it will spread even further. I certainly know from my experiences before that Erdogan himself was concerned over refugee buildup coming in from Syria into Turkey. And that will be even more of a concern now, because he will now say, on top of possible refugees, we would also have the risk of infection. Let's not forget that Turkey has some of the highest infection rates right now within the Middle East, so they're already struggling. And I think they would be very careful at this point to ensure that the ceasefire holds, if only to maintain or to minimize ongoing infection rates and the risk of refugees coming in who may also be infected.
Okay, Mr. Ghany, think that this pandemic has actually made the warring factions in Syria in particular more cautious, and they have reduced their activity in the country?
Indeed, actually, we noticed that in our monitoring that the casualties is declining and the lowest month. But our concern actually and our focus in elsewhere, which we are focusing on the detainees. Actually, we are afraid of the widespread in between the detainees of the COVID-19, due that the regime till this moment seizing and capture at least 130,000 Syrian in his center detentions. This is our main concern. The second concern in between the ITP, the circumstances of the camps. Actually, those are main major points. Why? First of all, as I mentioned, the high level of the prisoners or the detainees. And here we are talking about activists and politician, human rights defender, or protesters who just protest and against Syrian regime. We noticed in March that the regime released few, less than 30 Syrian from those, which is nothing actually. If the regime continue like we got to conclusion that the regime needs 325 years to release all of those detainees, unlike actually his partners, Iranian regime, which is also a theocratic dictatorship, but Iranian actually did well toward his population in this regard and released about 60,000 based on the BBC International. But Assad regime, on contrary, still releasing nothing. And by other hand, the healthcare inside Syria after what is the regime attitude against the medics worker by targeting them or by targeting also the special hospitals as well, and also out of his control hospitals. Today or yesterday, the Board of Inquiry from the UN published their report about about targeting the medical facilities in northwest Syria, and they found out that those are almost the seven medical facilities almost destroyed, and we know very well that the Russian and the regime is almost destroyed the medical facilities in northwest Syria, which
Mr.
is
Ghany,
contained.
you're of the view the regime and the Russian forces with them are actually already targeting the medical facilities in the country, and that is a big threat to the overall welfare of the people in the country. But in any sort of way, can this pandemic provide the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad an opportunity to understand the severity of the situation and take the control of more territories as other warring factions become cautious, and show the world that it has the efficiency and the capacity to control this one?
You cannot imagine how Assad dealing with this pandemic actually. Threatening, we got a news and we will publish a report. Assad security forces is threatening the doctors and the nurses to announce any cases. So Assad is want to control this by hiding the announcing of those cases and convince the families that the cause of this is something else, not due to COVID-19. This is the Assad strategy actually, and why we notice very low figures in Syria. Syria is a very vulnerable countries as the Iranian militia troops is still exporting to Syria lots of troops through Al-Bukamal crossroad and through the also the planes as well. So Assad regime is treating in very disaster way. We know that Assad, the first case announcement at 23rd of March. So already this the first case is very much late actually. And how much now announcement is nothing actually. It's not reflecting. And what we are getting from inside the government hospitals and the private hospitals is disaster actually. And Assad prevent any of those doctors or nurses to announce, and Assad need to control this, and announcement just come from his ministry at all.
Okay, Mr. Ghany, I'll come to this very particular point. As you say, the Assad regime is not taking this particular pandemic very seriously, and already there are so many problems. They've been hitting the medical supplies in the country as well. I'll come to you, Mr. Duke Gundersen. As the Western countries we have seen have been hit hard by the pandemic, do you think their focus has shifted from these conflicts in these countries to the problem being faced at home?
Irony here in the sense that up until recently, with the so-called refugee crisis, we heard Western countries saying we have to put up fences or walls, we have to close our borders, and now we see that is certainly happening across Europe, for example, across Western nations. So yes, there has been a shift to that kind of focus. And we also see some countries in the EU are basically being left to their own devices instead of being helped. Each country is now exercising individualism, saying, you know, we're on our own, we have to deal with this ourselves. I would also like to add that when it comes to Syria, certain countries like Jordan that have completed a very effective lockdown, this is a country that has previously absorbed, if I may use that term, a certain number of Syrian refugees, and I now believe that that will not be the case. Borders are going to close in the Middle East as well. So you have now, for example, Syrian refugees will struggle to be able to leave, and we will see a buildup of more internally displaced persons. Already in a place like Jordan, we see that refugee camps within Jordan have gone into lockdown. So I expect that the next step would be to say we're not accepting anyone else from outside the country.
Okay, I'll come to the internally displaced people and the problem, the refugees that they might be facing in coming days or weeks. But talking about the attention of the Western countries, as you have mentioned, that yes, they are facing the problem in their home countries. That's why their attention has diverted from the conflicts from this region to their own home countries. Could this particular diversion of their attention towards their home countries could lead to an early withdrawal of their resources, in particular the military resources from countries like Syria and Iraq in particular?
It's quite possible. I expect that with the United States, for example, they may hesitate to do that because they may think that the long-term view may be to actually ensure that they stay inside. I believe that certain actors in the West, especially Russia, would see Syria as a zero-sum game. If you withdraw, someone else will take your place. At the same time, as cases continue to increase, there will be a focus on increasing funding for healthcare, and various governments in the West will come under increasing scrutiny for how they spend their money. Why are you not spending money on combating COVID-19 will be a common question that people ask. Certainly in the US, we're seeing a huge number of cases on a daily basis, I think, rising. So we get to the point where I do believe some of these countries will have to have a domestic focus. And for the short to medium term, we will just be discussing the coronavirus. That will be the main security focus rather than adventures abroad.
Okay, Motee, as we have got the reports that the Turkish Defense Ministry has said that they are trying to reduce the mobilization of its troops and resources. And do you think this reduction in this mobilization would actually give room to the warring sides, particularly when we talk about Libya in terms of the forces which are led by General Khalifa Haftar? Would they have a sort of an upper hand in comparison to the prowess of the government of national accord in the country?
I think that we will notice in the future, in the near future, shifting from the military operation toward the peace talking, and also the security forces operation. So there will be shifting from the military operation, definitely due to COVID-19. Fears that it will spread in between both sides. Actually, it will affect Assad troops being affected, and there is like fear that it's due to the circumstances of Assad troops, lack of medical treatment and lack of cleaning. In the other hand, also or the other side, the opposition troops and the Turkish soldier, due to the disaster situation of the medical facilities in that area, there will be no fear to have more casualties or injured people. So that now we hear talking about continue discussion of the Constitutional Committee to the political path in this regard. Our concern now in this moment that Assad and Iranian and the Russian is playing on long term, not on short term. What Assad did and what is still not noticed, Assad is shifting his troops from north to the south toward Daraa and Sweda to control those areas which are still limited out of his hand. So he is managing his power, and as I said, not only shifting toward political movement, but also toward to the security forces, which we are noticing increasing of the detention. The previous months, we recorded 74 cases of detention. In spite, the previous months, in March, there is amnesty decree from Assad regime. In spite of this decree, we noticed that the continuity of the detention is still going on.
Okay. I'll come to you, Mr. Gundersen, with the point that, like Libya, the warring sides in Yemen also welcomed the UN call for a ceasefire. But sooner we saw that both of them returned to fighting. So the Yemeni people have already been facing the conditions with poverty and even no water available. How do you see the COVID-19 pandemic affecting the country?
Well, of course, it's going to come on top of existing damage to infrastructure, livelihood, and socioeconomic long-term damage. I think one of the issues we're going to see is in some countries, as opposed to a ceasefire, certain parties will actually try to take advantage of coronavirus as a distraction. At a time when the world is focused only on COVID-19, they'll say that this is a perfect opportunity to expand territory or to get more aggressive when the world is not paying attention. So my colleague just now talking about Syria and Assad trying to capture more territory. I can imagine in Yemen that may also be the case. We have to see how many parties are affected and how many cases increase in a place like Yemen, to what extent that would help a ceasefire hold. Because obviously you get to the point where you have to ensure that people are not forced to move or displaced so that the virus is not able to rapidly spread. And in order for that to happen, you do have to have ceasefires that hold.
So if the ceasefire doesn't happen to be, so could there be any possibility that the people are already facing dire conditions in the country, the humanitarian aid, especially in terms of medical supplies, to be sent to the country by the UN and its agencies?
It's certainly a case, but I think also another aspect may be that some international organizations may pressure certain actors in Yemen to also send humanitarian aid instead of sending arms and weapons, to basically say, look, we all need to band together at this time. This is a global pandemic. It's affecting everybody in different ways. Let's band together. Let's agree to send in humanitarian aid.
Okay, talking of Iran and the US, we have seen both of these countries have been the worst hit by the pandemic. But we have seen the United States deployed a Patriot, a defense missile system in Iraq that actually escalated the tensions once again amid COVID-19. How do you see that?
Well, that's most unfortunate for starters, but also it goes to show that the United States under Donald Trump, they're not necessarily going to prioritize COVID-19. Donald Trump, as president of the United States, is not really someone who has pushed a balanced Middle Eastern foreign policy. He's really been about exerting maximum pressure. And there are some who speculate that under COVID-19, he may actually take advantage of that even further and continue escalation, continue maximum pressure at a time when certain countries are more vulnerable.
Mr. Duke, Gundersen, as speak of Palestine, we've seen that the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had a difficulty in forming the government over there. Then he called for a unity government in order to combat this pandemic in the country. On the other side, we see that there is one agenda from all the political factions in Israel about annexing more settlements from the West Bank. How do you see that happening?
Well, again, at this time, we may see that COVID-19 becomes a further excuse for shoring up more authoritarianism, not just in Israel, but in other parts of the Middle East and even here in Europe. We're going to start asking, will the further restriction of freedom under the pretense of combating COVID-19 actually act as a political excuse for certain leaders to shore up more power, including territorial expansion?
But if different political factions within Israel could think of forming a unity government and together fight the COVID-19 pandemic, could there be a possibility that the people sitting at the helm in Israel could think of coordinating things with the people in Palestine as well?
It is possible, but I think that someone like Netanyahu, he may still feel that he can shore up his authority at this point. Let's not forget that this is a man who was indicted. He has said that there's been a conspiracy against him from the left wing. So I feel that he would still prioritize being, in power and prioritize his authority. However, as COVID-19 continues to spread, he may feel that he has no choice but to cooperate. We may see temporary alliances being formed in the medium term, but I also expect that we will see increasing authoritarianism by certain leaderships as well.
So, Mr. Duke, about the aid cut after the announcement of the Middle East peace plan by the United States, the aid which was meant for Palestinians were all cut by the United States. And at this crucial time when they required the maximum humanitarian assistance, where they should actually look forward to?
Well, here we have an issue because, of course, the U.S. may be looking more internally at this point, domestically over its own crisis vis-a-vis the coronavirus. If Trump is smart, he would reinstate that aid. But again, I don't feel that he's going to backtrack even when he's pushed into a corner and people are pressuring him to do so. I understand from my own research and from my contacts that Qatar is one country that has also been providing some aid to Gaza and to Palestine. So I think that that would be a more sensible option for the Palestinians to consider.
Mr. Duke, there have been reports that the Palestinians who are working in Israel, they are not being paid on time at all, particularly at this time of the pandemic as well.
Yes, that's correct. I think that, again, we still see divisiveness. Even at a time when people should be banding together, we still see this form of discrimination, and it comes as no surprise. It goes back to my point previously of, the idea of division, the idea of someone like Netanyahu shoring up his position and not changing the way he behaves towards others. That is not necessarily going to break.
So talking about the overall dynamics in this particular region, the countries we have already discussed, including Syria, Libya, Yemen, the case of Israel and Palestine and Iraq, do you think that the people sitting at the helm would have a realization that these conflicts which were brewing since a long time, it's not to escalate tensions on those lines, rather the whole humanity is actually facing one single common enemy, and that is COVID-19?
Well, I certainly hope that more and more leaderships will have this realization. Let's focus on, for example, the fact that certain leaders have actually been infected with COVID-19. In the UK, Boris Johnson is currently hospitalized because of it. And in Iran, we've seen certain members of the regime also infected. What this should tell us, it should act as a reminder that viruses don't respect borders or ideology. And now is not the time for division. Now is the time for unity. So I'd like to think that because high-ranking officials in some countries have also been affected by COVID-19, it would force various leaderships to eventually realize they have to come together to fight this virus.
Mr. Gundersen, please hold for a second. We've been joined now by Mr. Motee Msabeh, analyst and a political activist in Hamas movement, joining us from Gaza. Mr. Msabeh, thank you for your time at Newswire. What is the situation on the ground in Palestinian territories at the moment as they are facing the threat of COVID-19 as well? And particularly tell us about the situation the people in Gaza Strip particularly are facing at this point in time.
Yes, first of all, thanks for having me. Actually, in 2012, let me remind you that the UN reported that by 2020, Gaza will be an unlivable place due to the ongoing Israeli siege against Gaza that has been imposed since 2007. We are talking about 14 years 14 years of siege that severely affected the humanitarian conditions in Gaza Strip even before COVID hit the world and spread around the world. The humanitarian conditions here in Gaza are catastrophic. We are talking about 45% of the Palestinians are unemployed. We are talking about 50% of shortage in the medical supplies for Gaza Strip. We are talking in a deterioration in the buildings, hospitals, the medical supplies allowed by the Israeli controlled crossings of Gaza. So if we are talking about COVID-19, none of the measures approved by the World Health Organizations can be applied here in Gaza. When we are talking about 60 intensive care units, intensive care unit beds here in Gaza, which is considered as the drop in the ocean, given that Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas in the world, with its 2 million Palestinian citizens living there. We have here about 90%, about 95% of the aquifers of the underground water are polluted and not even suitable for the humanitarian use. We are talking about very harmed and very destructive infrastructure for sewage and water. So the hygienic procedures and measures are unavailable here in Gaza. So the situation is catastrophic. Israel is highly recommended to end its offensive policy against Gaza Strip. We are not talking today about a political or security issues. We are talking about a pure humanitarian issue that touch the whole world. When the Israeli Prime Minister or when the Israeli Defense Minister Naftali Bennett tries to bend the humanitarian and medical supplies allowance to Gaza, with the political and security issues such like the Israeli soldiers detained in Gaza. This is, to me, is considered as a matter of political and moral bankruptcy. You cannot even, this sensitive time, try to bind this security and political issue with a pure humanitarian issue. Today we are saying that there is a scourge looming to Gaza if the conditions, if the policy of the Israeli occupation remains as it is.
So, Mr. Msabeh, as you have described at length that what exactly the situation over there in the Palestinian territories is, and there is the huge threat of COVID-19 that is hanging like a sword on the heads of the Gazans who had been under siege for the last 14 years. What do you expect from the international big organizations, including the United Nations and the WHO, in order to convince the Israeli authorities to let at least the medical supplies and the humanitarian aid reach to the Gazans?
Okay, as I have told you, that even before the COVID spread and hit the world, the humanitarian conditions here in Gaza are severely bad. So we are in a very sensitive situation. It's the humanitarian organization, it's the UN responsibility and the international community responsibility to enforce Israel to change its policy, especially and particularly in these times. We are here in front of a catastrophic situation here in Gaza. So it's not acceptable to stay the situation as it was going before the COVID spread. If we are not going to change, if Israel not going
so Mr. Msabeh, you say that we are not talking about any sort of a political thing or any sort of a thing that is related to security at this point in time, which is very crucial. The entire world is in the grip of COVID-19. The international agencies and the WHO, including the UN, should come forth and impress upon the Israeli authorities to let the humanitarian aid and the medical supplies reach to Palestinian territories. Thank you for being with us on Newswire. Mr. Motee Msabeh, analyst, joining us from Gaza, and Mr. Nicolai Gundersen, a Middle East expert who was joining us from London. With this, we come to the end of the first segment of the Newswire. After a short break, we'll discuss Taliban's warning of peace deal nearing a breaking point. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Newswire. I'm Jawad Tehami. After 19 years of protracted war in Afghanistan, the US and the Taliban signed a peace deal in Doha on 29th of February, paving a way for a permanent political settlement in the war-torn country. According to the deal, the intra-Afghan talks between the Taliban and Afghan stakeholders were to commence on 10th of March. On this first day of negotiations, Afghan government was to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners, while the group was to release 1,000 prisoners as a confidence-building measure. The United States, on its part, along with its foreign allies, was to take immediate steps towards complete withdrawal of the forces from the country in 14 months. However, some days ago, the US announced $7.1 million to support its ongoing drones operations with Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. Now, the Taliban have warned that the peace deal is nearing a breaking point, accusing Washington of violations that include drone attacks, while also criticizing the Afghan government for delaying the release of the Taliban prisoners. However, the US has denied the accusations to discuss the continuously changing dynamics of the Afghan peace process and the purpose behind Taliban's warning of the peace deal nearing breaking point. We are joined at Newswire today by Mr. Hashim Wahdatyar, analyst from Washington, D.C., and Mr. Kaunert, analyst and director of the International Center for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales from London. Thank you for your time at Newswire. I'll start the discussion with you, Mr. Wahdatyar. How do you see this warning by the Taliban of the peace deal going towards the breaking point?
Well, thank you. The peace agreement between the United States and the Taliban is absolutely at the breaking point. The reason for that is that an important term within this agreement is reduction in violence. But the question here is that, have you seen reduction in violence of the Taliban in Afghanistan? No. Have they reduced the number of attacks on the Afghan people? The answer is no. Have they reduced the killing of the Afghans? The answer is no. So absolutely it is at the breaking point started by the Taliban. So the other thing is that the Afghan people were hopeful that this is a peace talks with the Taliban and there will be a political settlement in Afghanistan. But the United States and Taliban peace agreement is more a withdrawal agreement rather than being a peace agreement in Afghanistan. It is a win-win situation for the United States and the Taliban. But where is the win for the government of Afghanistan elected by the Afghan people? Unless there's Afghan government involved actively in the peace process, there will be no peace settlement in Afghanistan. It will be more a withdrawal for the US and then winning of the Taliban, because Taliban are not after the peace in Afghanistan. They are after is returning of the Islamic Emirate of the Taliban that they are calling it.
So it's basically the attitude and behavior from the Taliban that is not letting the permanent peace happen in the war-torn country. I'll take this very point to Mr. Kaunert. Do you have the same point of view that it is because of the Taliban's attitude that the peace and the intra-Afghan negotiations are not commencing?
Yes, I mean, firstly, I agree with the previous speaker. Of course, the first responsibility lies with the Taliban and their non-ending of violence. I think that is something that is vital and crucial, in fact, in order to build the kind of trust that is necessary to advance peace talks. But I think in addition to that, while this is true, there's obviously two more elements. One, the previous speaker already alluded to, and that is that this is an agenda that is driven not so much by the interest in creating a peaceful situation, but by the United States losing, in a sense, faith and losing resources and wanting to withdraw to a certain extent. And therefore, the timetable and the agenda is being shaped by that. And then secondly, it's also the exclusion of the Afghan government from those initial discussions, from those initial negotiations that were exclusively between the United States and the Taliban. As a result of that, it is very difficult for the Afghan government to have sufficient faith and trust in the process, because ultimately what's important to them is what kind of guarantees do they have of the continued existence of the democratic process in Afghanistan post-negotiations and post-settlement.
Okay, both of you, that it's because of the Taliban behavior. They just don't want to have a permanent political and peace settlement in Afghanistan. But according to the deal, when the US has to start taking the measures for the withdrawal of the troops, including all the private security contractors, trainers, advisors, and supporting services personnel within 14 months, then how can it have new contracts to support its drone mission in Afghanistan? Isn't it itself a violation of the peace deal, which are actually warning about?
Hopefully. Well, I think in a sense it is very difficult to eventually reach that kind of peace negotiations, because of course when a peace deal is not working, then of course all sides can claim that something in the agreement is not working because it's a quid pro quo. So just by merely pointing out that this little bit in the peace agreement is not working, that doesn't mean that you are not to blame for it, because of course all of those pieces hang together. But the important step here is in a sense that from the beginning the Afghan government was excluded from the discussions and from the negotiations. It was a peace negotiation between the United States and the Taliban, and this was never going to be likely to be a successful negotiations if the kind of stakeholder, the main stakeholder, which is the Afghan society and the Afghan political system, Afghan government, is excluded from those, because they are the ones that need to trust that this is something that is really going to happen. And having been excluded from the outside, it's very difficult to later reintroduce them as a player to kind of keep faith and trust in that system.
Mr. Wahdatyar, I'll come to you with the same point. According to the deal, the US has to start taking immediate measures, which the Taliban have warned about, that this particular peace deal is nearing a breaking point. How can a country which has already made a deal with the other faction can go into the contracts of maintaining its support services or the drone operations in that country?
Well, let me tell you something. The thing is that United States is making a very big mistake in Afghanistan, including the international community. Like, in general, we have to discuss this. And that is that still the United States have not understood and known the Taliban, like what the Taliban are after. And that is a key point, and it's very, very important. The Taliban says to everybody, to the region, to the international community, that they are fighting because the United States has invaded Afghanistan. Okay, but now they have ceased fire with the United States. They are not fighting the United States, but they're still continuing fighting the Afghans. They're still continuing killing the Afghans. So that clearly means that they are not after peace in Afghanistan. They want to remove all their barriers in front of them, whether they are international community, the United States, or the Afghan government, whoever. They are bringing back their regime back to the country. And even though if there is no drone, even though if there is no attack by the international community, they will continue to pursue their agenda. They will continue to do that because they have violated a number of terms of these the agreement, and they will continue doing that unless they bring their own regime in entire country. Look, there are a number of commanders of the Taliban in Afghanistan. They don't agree with the political council of the Taliban in Qatar. They have internal indifferences within the Taliban group. They are there for two objectives to achieve. Number one, returning the Taliban. Number two, implementing Sharia law in entire country. Do you agree with these two? No, absolutely. The Afghans don't agree. The international community do not agree because there are human rights violations and a number of other things.
Okay, Mr. Wahdatyar, as you've just said that the Taliban continue to increase violence despite the peace deal they have signed with the US. But according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalists, there have been 5 US airstrikes in Afghanistan in 2020 alone, in which closer to 60 people have been reportedly killed, including 3 to 4 children. And one strike which was carried out only 4 days after the signing of the peace deal in Helmand, which was also accepted by the US for Afghanistan spokesperson. So doesn't it mean that the warning issued by the Taliban has a legitimacy in itself?
Look, when there was a peace agreement, there was agreement on reduction of violence. But look at from the beginning of the days, this reduction was broken. This term was broken by the Taliban, who killed like 22 Afghan security forces. Okay, and also like in their attacks, number of Afghans have killed, and the attacks dramatically increased. So the term or this agreement has been broken from the first few weeks when the agreement was signed. Okay, so when the conflict increased, then of course both sides or the three parts, like US and the Afghan government, Taliban, they start fighting each other because the Afghan government has to defend itself. Okay, so from the very beginning, the terms have been broken.
Okay, Mr. Kaunert, I'll take this very point to you. There are 5 US airstrikes in Afghanistan, and one which I've already mentioned 4 days after the signing of the peace deal. Mr. Wahdatyar alluded to that the Taliban have kept on increasing the violence themselves, so they are also not complying with the different clauses of the deal. But doesn't this particular acceptance of such strikes give some room to the Taliban to carry on their violence as well?
Well, I think at the heart of a peace agreement is that all violence ceases. So, of course, this is the end state that the conflicting parties want to achieve. But the question then is, how do you get to that state? Is there sufficient trust between the parties that both parties want to achieve that particular state? And I would imagine that at this particular point, there isn't that sufficient trust in existence. Of course, the United States need to commit military operations in Afghanistan because they're committed to the Afghan government, to the situation in Afghanistan, and so on. But longer term, if there is a reduction in violence, like the previous speaker spoke, if the Taliban reduce their violence, if the government can trust that in fact peace negotiations are serious. If we look at, for instance, peace negotiations in Northern Ireland, it was very clearly a quid pro quo between the IRA, the British government, British military forces, and so on. This did not mean that because one side is starting to reduce, that certainly everything ceases. And in this particular case, this is similar. The Taliban essentially have to reduce their violence in order to have a legitimate claim to say that the other sides should be doing so too.
Mr. Christian Kaunert, thank you for being at Newswire, Director of International Center for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales, joining us from London, and Mr. Hashim, Wahdatyar Analyst and Senior Program Manager at Civic, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you for your time at Newswire. With this, we come to the end of today's Newswire. With more in-depth analysis on major happenings from around the world, we'll be back with you tomorrow. Until then, take good care.